You just told me Omar.
Sorry. Omar, that the director of the Runnymede Trust, and as you are aware, the Runnymede Trust is really the preeminent organisation to race issues in the UK. The Runnymede Trust has been going through lots of change, but nonetheless, it's been able to keep its platform and generate a great deal of work and keep public focus, on this agenda. I'm really pleased that we're not here today. So,
thank you, Ed, for that very kind introduction, and it's fine to call me Omar. Just call me Dr. Pell. Okay, so Anthony, when he asked me to give a speech, I thought that I'd focus on what can policy do. And I'll first outline some of the challenges in terms of the evidence, and then I'll try to be somewhat optimistic about some opportunities, because I think the context is a bit negative in terms of policy, but in that context we've got to think what kinds of changes, what difference can policy make? That's who Runnymede is. As Anthony's already introduced us, we've been around since 1968, and we primarily do research, but we do research that tries to influence policy. We're a little bit different, obviously, from a straight academic institution in that way, and we also engage with communities, so community organizations across the country to the extent that we can. I do sit on the independent government advisory group at the Department for Work and Pensions, and we also hold the secretariat for the all-party group on race in Parliament, which is chaired by David Lammy. So we do try through that to influence parliamentarians and policymakers about race. I just thought I'd give you briefly some context. Oops, sorry. I've lost some lines there. I'm sorry about that. Basically, on the far left is 2001, and on the far right is 2051. So it's showing you the increase in the black and minority ethnic population. In 2001, it was 9% of the population and 4.5 million people. By 2051, it will be 30% of the population, over 20 million black and minority ethnic people living in Britain. So if we have a 12% employment gap, which we do in Britain, which is equivalent to 500,000 missing workers from the labor market, i.e. if the black and minority ethnic employment rate was equivalent to the white British employment rate, you'd have 500,000 more people in the labor market. If we don't close that gap by 2051, that will be 1 million missing workers in the labor market, which is obviously unfair and unjust on black and minority ethnic people, but also throws into question Britain's ability to stay in the top table in terms of economic performance around the world. That's the data from this 2001 census by ethnic group. Don't need to go into a lot of detail. I just thought I'd show it because it shows mixed populations growing significantly, but also some other groups growing significantly, and that's in this chart. One of the things that's quite interesting is there's a lot of questions around ethnic categorization, and one of the things I wanted to show here was that one of the reasons ethnic categories grow is actually not just because of population growth, but how people self-identify. So if you look at the Caribbean number, there's only been 4% growth in that population between 2001 and 2011, and a lot of people interpret that as more mixed race couples, fewer children born of Caribbean households. But actually part of it is also because the grandchildren of migrants who came from Jamaica don't identify as Caribbean anymore. They identify as black, British, or even black African. And you can see that the other black category there grew by 186% over that same period. So I just wanted to get at that, which is that when we're talking about ethnic statistics, one question is, which populations are growing, but a second question is, how do people self-identify? Do they identify in the ways that their parents did? Is race changing in the sense in which people experience and feel about these issues? And that is, I think, one example of many as to how the statistics are changing over time. Turning now to outcomes. So one aspect of keeping data on ethnicity is to capture people's self-identification, but the other key aim of statistics on ethnicity is to try to determine how different groups are affected in society by policies and by employment and by things like housing. This shows, the line is The numbers below the line is the proportion of children living in poverty within each ethnic minority group. And as you can see, for all ethnic minority groups, there's higher rates of child poverty than there are for the white majority. So leading up to almost half of Pakistani children being in poverty. And one of the reasons I wanted to flag this, I mean, it's tragic and bad for the children to be growing up in households with inadequate income. But the effect of the changes to tax credits will inevitably lead to even worse child poverty, because 10% of Pakistani and Bangladeshi household income derives from tax credits versus only 2% of white British household income and 6% of black households' income. So cuts to tax credits, cuts to child tax credits as well, because you have higher children per household, will inevitably increase racial inequalities and child poverty. The other thing that I wanted to point to is, when we look at poverty, one of the concerns that people have is more around persistent poverty. A lot of people think it might be acceptable for people to dip into poverty for a few months, you know, when you lose your job, or maybe when you're a young person. And so we perhaps could not eliminate poverty entirely from a society. We might aim to do so, but the really concerning point is persistent poverty, where people are in poverty for years in a row, where they are unable to escape poverty. It's not just a temporary condition when they have to look after their older parent, or when they lose their job, or when they're a young person first trying to find work in the labor market. And as you can see there, persistent poverty is a particular problem for black, African, and Pakistani groups, and all those groups have higher rates of persistent poverty. Part of that is because of low wage, and again, this shows the likely impact of tax credit changes, which will particularly hit different groups. One of the other reasons I want to show you this chart is the difference between men and women in different groups. So in the white British group, the majority population, women are much more likely to be on low pay, and that's partly reflected by their higher rates of part-time work and the kinds of work that part-time work unfortunately means in this country. As most of you probably know, part-time work generally is low-paid work in the UK, and we need to do something to improve that. But among Bangladeshis, actually, men are more likely to be in low-paid work than Bangladeshi women. And also amongst the black Caribbean population, the gap is a bit narrower. So a lot of this low wage is driven by what's called, in the economics literature, occupational segregation. That basically means the kinds of jobs people do. And the kinds of jobs that are low paid, as we know, are in particular sectors of the economy, i.e. catering, hospitality, caring responsibilities, of which a large proportion are black and minority ethnic, Filipino carers, Nigerian carers, and as I think an interesting question about what will happen with the reforms to immigration, whereby you have to have £18,000 plus income, where if you look on the job market, starting salaries for carers, it's much below that. So we have an aging population with increasing demand for caring, and yet one of the major sources of carers, about a quarter of carers are immigrants, is being cut. So we're going to have a real challenge there, I think, in terms of care for older people. But generally, just wanted to show other white is quite interesting there too, the highest proportion. Those are obviously, in this context, are mainly Eastern European migrants, but both African and Bangladeshi people are persistently in low-paid incomes, and most groups are higher, obviously, than the white British group. But it's not just the case that it's about poor people with bad qualifications. As most of you probably know, black minority ethnic people are more likely to attend university nowadays. Actually, there are higher education participation rates amongst black and minority ethnic people, but they tend not to get as good jobs as you'd anticipate from those qualifications. So this is looking at the proportion of graduates who are overqualified for their jobs. And as you can see, 40% of black African graduates are overqualified for the job that they're doing. I mean, it's quite distressing even the fact that 20% of white graduates are overqualified for the jobs they're doing. We're creating up a real problem here with graduates doing jobs that are really below their qualification levels. And it's a major question mark for our universities and for our labor market and for our employers. Are they doing enough to ensure that those graduates, our policymakers, our employers, our universities doing enough to ensure that graduates are actually getting jobs that are appropriate for them, but particularly black and minority ethnic graduates seem to be doing badly. And one of the other things I wanted to show here was that Chinese graduates are overqualified. So one of the positive stories you often hear when you talk to policymakers about race, I often will get it knocked back to me to say, well, race isn't the problem it was in the 1980s. look at how well Indians and Chinese people are doing in education. This shows that you may do well in education, but it's not translation into the labor market. And so the fact that Chinese parents are very good at creating aspirations in their children, which is something the government shouldn't take any responsibility for in any case. But the reality then being that even Indian and Chinese graduates are getting jobs below their qualifications suggests that racial inequalities are still a persistent feature in the labor market.